Hello ANP1 students. In this video we are going to start talking about the skeletal system. I wanted to show you a couple of cartoons though that I found humorous, so that might brighten your day. So here's one of them. Here's the other one, just in case you're not an animal person like I am. Maybe you like vegetables more. And then the last one, again, another animal one. So hopefully that brought a smile to your face, or a chuckle. So we are going to start talking about chapter 10 is what we're on. And so chapter 10, oops, I'm gonna just minimize that. So chapter 10, it talks about all three types of muscle tissue that we learned about in lab, so skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. But we're primarily going to focus on the skeletal muscle tissue areas of this chapter 10. And then the cardiac muscle and the smooth muscle, I usually talk about that in more detail when we get to those certain chapters where we're talking about the cardiovascular system and we're talking about the digestive system, blood vessels, urinary system, the ones that have smooth muscle associated with them. So we're going to focus on skeletal muscle tissue, and our first objective, little mouse doesn't want to move here, is just to list the functions of skeletal muscle tissue. And so some of these may not be surprising. So definitely, if I ask students what the functions of our skeletal muscles are, they generally will say movement, which is true. So that's kind of a big one and one we're very familiar with. And then a lot of times they'll also say support. So support's down here, and that's true as well. But there's some others that may be, less well known. We do talk about the maintenance of our posture is the function of the skeletal muscle. So again, that's not so much movement as just keeping our bodies in a certain position. And the protection part, just like our skeletal system protected vital organs, so like if you remember the ribs and the sternum, spinal cord, or the spinal column and the skull, bones of the skull, that all was protecting like vital organs, heart and lungs and spinal cord and brain. But we do have skeletal muscle that is there to protect other areas of the body that aren't protected by the skeletal system. And so one example would be our external oblique and our internal oblique muscles, transversus abdominis, rectus abdominis. Those are an example of muscles that are protecting and supporting the organs that are in our abdomen or abdominal pelvic cavity. So that is another function of our skeletal muscles. So body movement, support, protection, maintaining our posture, and then the other two, usually people don't think of this one, even though it's something that we are familiar with, but we may not know that it's skeletal muscles that are doing this, is elimination of materials. So primarily we're talking about elimination of urine and feces. And so we're going to start talking about sphincters in this chapter, and then you'll specifically name certain sphincters within the body as we move on to other body systems. But they are there. They're circular, like a circular ring of muscle. And whenever they contract, then they will like close, and that will cause an opening to close. And then when they relax, they will cause an opening to cause a area to open up. And so that's the skeletal muscles that are associated with our urethra and our anal canal. And so when we have to have the desire, or we're getting the signal that we need to go to the restroom, we consciously control our skeletal muscles. So we will send a signal to those skeletal muscles and cause them to contract and not let, urine or anything come out at that point. And then when we are ready to release those, eliminate those materials, then we'll relax those skeletal muscles. So that's one that's not as well known by most people. So we'll talk more about sphincters as we go through the rest of the body systems too. And then the final function is heat production. And we've talked about this when we talked about body temperature, homeostasis, or thermoregulation. We talked about how, and this was the second law of thermodynamics, where whenever energy is transferred from one form to another, a byproduct is heat. And remember, heat is, it can't be used. It's kind of a worthless thing as far as like being used for work. But it does have a role in keeping our bodies at that normal temperature. So like 80% of the heat in our body is actually from when our muscles contract and we convert chemical energy to mechanical energy. We get a lot of heat as a byproduct of that process. And so that is a big function of our skeletal muscles, is to keep us warm. So keep our body temperature where it needs to be. All right, so those are the functions that you should be familiar with the skeletal system. And again, most of them you're probably pretty familiar with, but there's some that may be new to you. So, all right, so the next thing that we're gonna talk about is the connective tissues of skeletal muscles. So I think this week we'll primarily focus on the anatomy. So that's what a lot of this is. And we're going to, like in lab, you learned the gross anatomy of the skeletal muscles. You're identifying the biceps brachii and the sternocleidomastoid and the vastus intermedius and the gluteus maximus, all those muscles that you can see without a microscope. In lecture, we need to talk about how the skeletal muscles actually shorten, contract. And so in order to do that, we have to understand, because it's the individual cells that are doing that together, and we have to know their anatomy. So we're going to learn about the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle cells, and they also call them fibers. So that's another name for them, because they're just long and cylindrical, so they kind of look like a fiber. So that's what we'll focus on primarily this first week, learning about chapter 10. And then we'll go on to more the physiology part. And then you have to understand the anatomy, because then when we talk about the physiology, we are going to use it's those particular anatomical parts that we talked about that are going to be involved in the physiology. So if you don't have a good hold or understanding of the anatomy, the physiology is not going to make much sense, and it's going to be hard to grasp. So, all right. So we're going to first talk about connective tissues of skeletal muscles. Let me flip through here. All right. So this is showing, you hopefully can visualize, this is the humerus, like the head of the humerus here. And then they kind of cut it off there. But so we're kind of looking at this muscle. This is a muscle that probably the biceps brachii in this case, that is running along the humerus here. So we'll talk more about this anatomy because they've sectioned it, did a cross section through it, or a transverse section through it, so we can look at that. But first we're going to talk about this connective tissue, this white membrane that's not muscle tissue, but made up of fibers, the connective tissue, so like collagen and elastin. All right, so, and this is important to understand because this is how the skeletal muscles are organized. So we can see the gross anatomy here. This is one whole skeletal muscle that we're looking at. So say the biceps brachii. So when we are looking at that muscle tissue, it is organized, kind of separated. The different parts of the skeletal muscle are separated by connective tissue. And that just helps to kind of keep everything together, but also kind of insulate and protect the structures, like mainly the skeletal muscle cells or fibers that are in there. And then it also has a role, the connective tissue that's part of the skeletal muscles has a role in forming the attachments of those muscles to the parts of the bone. So we'll talk about that too. So on this picture, there is connective tissue that is completely surrounding the entire skeletal muscle. So they use a prefix for these: epi, peri, and endo. So epi means on top of, remember. Peri means around, and then endo means inside or within. So those are the terms they're going to use to describe the location of this connective tissue that's surrounding the different structures of the skeletal muscle, and again, kind of protecting and insulating it and keeping it organized. So, and then the suffix behind that prefix is the mesium word, mesium. So, and that refers to muscle. So my, remember myo is muscle, so mesium. So that's how they name these connective tissues. And these are the three that you'll need to know. All right, so the connective tissue that is completely surrounding a skeletal muscle, so the entire skeletal muscle, is called epimesium. So that makes sense. It's like on top of the entire skeletal muscle that we're seeing. So they call that epimesium. And they kind of have it pulled back here, so you can kind of see that it's like a thin connective tissue. And then you can kind of see the layer that goes completely around the skeletal muscle. So that's epimesium. And then if we look, they did like a cross-section through this skeletal muscle. And you'll notice that we have these like bundles. They call them fascicles. So that's the term for bundles in A&P. So fascicles. So each one of, so this is like one fascicle, here's another fascicle, there's another fascicle, another fascicle. So each one of those is a fascicle, and each one of those has connective tissue that's surrounding it. And so that's what this is representing in here, this white connective tissue here. And they call that perimesium because it's around the fascicles. So they call it perimesium. All right, and then if we take one of those fascicles, which they did with this one, so this is like one of the fascicles, and they've kind of pulled it out. And then if you look inside a fascicle, it's kind of looks similar to this because you have these like little structures, cylindrical structures. Kind of you've seen them end on. Each one of those is a skeletal muscle cell, and again, another name for a muscle cell is muscle fiber, and they'll call it fiber because the skeletal muscle cells are very long and cylindrical, so they look like fibers. They kind of look like hairs. So that's why they will sometimes call them that. But in this picture, you have the muscle fibers or muscle cells, and then you have a connective tissue, which is this white that's around each one of them, and they call that endomesium. Okay, so those are the connective tissues that surround our skeletal muscle structures. And then realize that those three are going to continue. This is where the skeletal muscle ends. Those three connective tissues, the epimesium, perimesium, and endomesium, will continue even when the skeletal muscle stops. They'll continue, they'll kind of merge together and continue, and they will form tendons that will then attach to the bone. So they there for attachment as well as insulating and protecting of the skeletal muscle cell, or skeletal muscle organ. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk more